you want to solve a problem, you have to break it down. And, farming is no different. So I suppose I approach all these, with a lot of research, planning. I read a lot about it, and then I'll try it. Yes, I've failed, but I think, in fairness, every time you fail, you actually learn something. And sometimes you get a real win and you figure out, oh, why did that happen? So it's working out the reasons behind why things work and why things don't work, and then putting structure on that.
You're very welcome to the Tillage Edge podcast with me, Michael Hennessy. In this week's episode, we rejoined a conversation with Tom Barry, a tillage farmer from North Cork. In the first episode, we discussed how Tom's farm is using organic manures. In this episode, we continue the conversation about the rotation on the farm, and we're also joined by John Mahon, a Tillage Signpost advisor in Teagasc, to get an insight into the environmental profile on Tom's farm. In terms of your rotation, what's the ideal that you're aiming for? And let's just start out with winter beans, if that's kind of where you're on. We kind of build from there. So you have winter beans in year one. What do you try to go with after that, and we'll continue on from there?
Absolutely, without contest, winter wheat year two. First wheats, we're consistently getting 5 tons per acre. People might complain about the disease and pressures, but you know what? You're dealing with a crop that's very healthy, and it's getting a lot of nitrogen to start off with from the nodules and the beans. And Teagasc did an experiment there with Kieran Collins where we covered a subsequent area of winter wheat with a sheet, so it got no fertiliser at all. And I'm waiting for the results, but you could see quite clearly when we're harvesting that there was plenty of heads and plenty of yield. So the beans are delivering into the winter wheat. Following the winter wheat, I go with winter barley.
Yeah.
I'm a great believer. It's just me in two row varieties. I want to produce high quality, high yielding barleys. I'm getting good returns from that. We would be hoping to do a minimum of 4 tons, maybe a bit more. In the days when we had cassia, you could hit 4.5 tons, no bother. Straw is valuable, so it really helps the inputs there. Now, this is where it gets interesting. We move into our third crop after beans. And yes, we have a take-all situation, and you have to be careful. So what I like to slot in there for part of my rotation, part of my fields, is winter rye.
Okay.
Winter rye is, and that being said, again, I have to credit Dairygold in buying rye, because there's no good in growing a crop if you can't actually sell it. And they process a good rye every year now, and that means we have a market. Winter rye is quite an interesting crop. It doesn't like wet weather, so it allows you set the grain in mid-September, which is a real advantage to get going, given our weather. And it's a very low seeding rate. However, maybe 55 kgs a hectare. But if you get it in good conditions, it is a scavenger. It will root down, and it will just forage for P's, K's, N. And I like it because it mops up any. You can be guaranteed there'll be no runoff from a rye field, because it just will scavenge every bit of nutrients it can get. Which also means then when I get to the springtime, I'll put out slurries on it, and I will do my best to pull back on nitrogen and P's and K, and P's, not so much K, because it needs K. It's got such a demand for straw.
Is it all rye, Tom, in that slot, or have you got a mix of rye and something else?
No, it's not. I also fall into that slot. I might only grow, maybe, depends on the fields and in question. I also slot in winter oats there. Because winter oats, it won't suffer the take-all situation.
And in year 5 now, then, Tom, what do you end up with?
So then after the oats here, I have a choice. It just gives me flexibility. I might go back into a spring barley, or I might go back into, after the oats, or after I might go spring barley. I might also, it might give me an option. This year now, I might put in a bit of spring beans. So I'll be back into my winter beans, where I'll have 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I'll be I'll be back in every 5 years with my winter beans. But some fields are not suitable for winter beans, like some are heavier soils that I might find it difficult to get in, so I might need to go for a spring bean. But essentially, I like to get back in with a spring barley crop, and I have customers for spring barley as well. Um, Spring barley as well is becoming valuable now with regards to malting and with regards to food grade barley. So you can't let it out of your equation either. And looking at all those crops here, Michael, the one thing that the rotation allows me to do is to tackle with different chemistries the weeds, grass weeds such as blackgrass or sterile broom or any of those other funny things that cause tend to pop up. Because you can, this year now, for instance, with the rye, I was able to put out a pre-merge, and all these you might only be doing it once in every few years, but it's just keeping problematic weeds under control. Because since the abolition of IPU, and rightfully so, you have to be very mindful of weed and how to manage
Okay.
it.
John, can I just bring you in here? John, you've been working with Tom, and Tom has mentioned you a little bit around the Signpost farm, of which Tom is one of them. You've been measuring I suppose monitoring the Tom's performance and some of the inputs that he's putting in there, which all kind of relates back to maybe your greenhouse gas efficiency. What does that look like, and is there a relationship to that with the amount of nitrogen that Tom is using on his farm in comparison to the organic manures out there?
Well, Michael, yes, we what we do in Signpost, we use the National Farm Survey data collectors. They're part of the program since the 2021. And I suppose it offers us the opportunity to track any of the key marginal abatement cost curve measures that we might suggest to Tom that he'd adopt on the farm. So I suppose it gives us the opportunity in absolute terms to track that each year. The most recent data that we have available is for the entire 2023 cropping year. But in Tom's case there, for the total farm emissions, we're talking about a reduction of 26% versus these 2022 figures. Now, that comes to about roughly 352 tons of CO2 equivalent for the farm, but it was on a reduced area. So when we brought it back then on a per hectare basis, it represented a 7% reduction versus 2022. Now, what I would like to say on that figure, Tom mentioned there his use of lime. There was 208 tons of lime included in that, and lime, as you know, has a high carbon footprint, 0.44 of a ton of CO2 equivalent per ton applied. So that would have accounted for about 91 tons of that 352 tons, which is about 25% of it. So it's very encouraging to see that kind of a reduction, even with lime usage. And Tom's use of that lime is for nutrient use efficiency.
So John, just to clarify it, so lime is it's a big cost in terms of carbon from that
Yes,
point of view, and it's all counted in 1 year. But obviously, lime is useful for 5 years, so arguably it probably should be divided out over 5 years, arguably, unless you're putting, that whatever you said it was, whatever amount of tons it was, 80 tons of stuff on every year, then maybe it's okay. But if it's only once every now and then, probably should be divided over space of time.
absolutely. And it is something that we'd have a bit of a bugbear about, that it is counted in the year of use
And
in the figures.
And John, does Tom's overall figures compare well to other tillage farms coming through the system?
Yeah, very comparable. Of the signpost farms that we were keeping a track of, all of them would be below 1 ton of CO2 equivalent per hectare basis. Many of them are running around 0.6, 0.7 of a ton per hectare.
And that would be, all of those would be a good bit lower than the standard population in the National Farm Survey. So they're all doing relatively well.
Well, the National Farm Survey specialist tillage would normally, that figure would be running somewhere from 1.3 up to 2 tons per hectare, again, depending on the year as well. and
Okay.
production. In production figures, Michael, it is important to say that per hectare basis is probably not the absolute right way to count it. What we really need to get it back to is per unit of output. So we want to get it back to the equivalent of how many kgs of CO2 are we producing per kg of grain. Now, I've done rough estimates on Tom's figures, and it's working out probably in the region of 150 to 200 kgs per ton of cereals produced. If you take in straw chopping and oats and other parts of that, that figure will come down quite quickly.
Okay, and I suppose just to give listeners a little bit of I suppose an overall comparison, that if you're to compare that to grain maybe produced across in Europe, or lots of the imports, that'd probably be from 300 to 400 kgs per ton of grain. So Irish farms, including Tom, are a good bit underneath that. Last question for you, John. Just in terms of all of the changes that that Tom has made, are there more changes or tweaks that you think we could encourage Tom to implement on the farm to make a little bit more difference there?
We've highlighted his use of organic manures, which is second to none. But from, I suppose, the whole biodiversity and carbon capture side of things, it would be important to highlight that Tom has 15 hectares of mixed forestry, which he planted over 20 years ago, which is adding to his carbon capture figure. And I suppose Tom would be first to admit he would have put this in to prevent pesticides and fertilizers from entering the local River Blackwater, which is quite close to him. But it's making a huge contribution now on the whole carbon front. His second major I suppose change is his attention to detail on hedgerows and his change of management on the hedgerows. He also is very good at infilling and buying up to maybe 1,000 quips every year, and his use of planting new hedgerows as well. Soils, his attention to detail and soil health, structure, and avoiding damage is another key aspect of the farm. But most of all, I suppose, his willingness. He's always willing to try new things, and then his attention to detail when he does. For example, since joining the Signpost, he hadn't been growing cover crops, and he has introduced these and is aware of how it's contributing to some of his soils, which would be nitrate leaching.
Tom, last question to you. You mentioned it already, and certainly John has mentioned it as well. And it's often missing maybe on some tillage farmers that we meet. You appear to have a degree of bravery to take risks, to change your system, to see what happens, and then maybe to stick with that. How do you think that manifests itself on the farm, or what drives you to do that?
I started off life as a biochemist, and I remember thinking, if you want to solve a problem, you have to break it down, and farming is no different. So I suppose, I approach all these, with a lot of research, planning. I'd read a lot about it, and then I'll try it. Yes, I've failed, but I think, in fairness, every time you fail, you actually learn something. And sometimes you get a real win and you figure out, oh, why did that happen? So it's working out the reasons behind why things work and why things don't work, and then putting structure on that. And, I grew up in a dairy farm, and it was a mixed dairy farm. So we had cows, we had grain, cattle, and replacement heifers. And each year, the grain would be cut, the straw would be bedding the cows, the grain was feeding them, and then you'd plough up another grass field and you'd plant the grain there. The grain needed virtually no nitrogen at all because the ground was strong, and hence you had this rotation within the whole system, and the organic manures going back into the grain as well from the cow bedding. But now we've all become individual dairy farmers, tillage farmers, cattle farmers, and I feel we need to go back and replicate the cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the whole nutrient cycle, And to do that, we need to work with our neighbours. And if that's me taking stories to my dairy farmer neighbours who now can farm and keep their cows with the stringent nitrates rules, so be it. If it means even, and I'm very conscious of this, swapping land. Like the Irish have this obsession with their land, but you know what? You find that in a lot of dairy farmers, especially farms near their paths, especially, they have multiple soil issues, and that land needs to come out of grass for a few years in order for the soil to rejuvenate. And you know, that type of system where we're not wedded to our folio maps, but we're more concentrating on good soil and rotation. If we can display this, you know, and it won't happen overnight, and if we can work to get people working together in groups again, I feel we're going to notice the challenges of the nitrates less, because we won't need to be worrying about just pumping on more artificial nitrogen for a very little gain.
Tom, on that note of circularity, I think is the word that's kind of used very much around that. I think is a great place to stop in terms of your encouragement of people to work with their neighbours, which is lots of added benefits, not just in nitrogen, in terms of, you know, social aspects and everything else. It's always great to work with people rather than looking at them over the hedge. Tom, I really want to thank you very much, and congratulations again for winning the number of awards. I think it's well deserved. And to John, thanks very much for joining us today as well.
Thanks very much, Michael.
So that's all for this week, and my thanks again to John and Tom for joining me on the show. And finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.